The year is 1935, the year that the Parker brothers began marketing their game called Monopoly. The game of destroying friendships and creating chaos that is in the form of pure sweet capitalism. Now before we get into why we are here today, let's do a quick background on the famous board game. Let's roll back to 1903. A woman named Elizabeth McGee came up with an idea of a game which she hoped would explain the single tax theory of Henry George, who was in idle at the time for his book Progress and Poverty. It was intended as an educational tool to illustrate the negative aspects of concentrating land in private monopolies. George promoted the single tax on land, though he avoided that term. His writing was immensely popular in the 19th century in America and sparked several reform movements of the progressive era. He inspired the economic philosophy known as Georgism, based on the belief that people should own the value they produce themselves, but that the economic value derived from land, including natural resources, should belong equally to all members of society. He argued that a single tax on land would itself reform society and economics. McGee's game featured play money in deeds and properties that could be bought and sold. Players borrowed money, either from the bank or from each other, and they had to pay taxes. She filed a patent and the game was officially patented in 1904 and published in 1906. Charles Todd of Philadelphia recalled the day in 1932 when his childhood friend Ezra Jones and her husband Charles Darrow came to their house for dinner. After they had dinner, the Todds introduced Darrow to the landlord's game, which then they played several times. The game was entirely new to Darrow, and he asked the Todds for a written set of rules, and they gave it to him. After that night, Darrow went on to utilize this and distribute the game himself as Monopoly. Parker Brothers bought the game's copyrights from Darrow. When the company learned Darrow was not the sole inventor of the game, it bought the rights to Maggie's patent for just $500 in the late 1930s. Still to this day, even though Hasbro has purchased Parker Brothers, they still give credit to Darrow and not Maggie. Imagine coming up with a board game that has made millions of dollars just to receive $500 or $10,000 calculated for inflation. It's still unknown how Charles Todd got the board game 30 years after it was created, but in all honesty, if Darrow never got the rules from Todd, we wouldn't have the board game enjoyed and well hated that we have today. I could explain more of the history of the game itself and the different versions, but that's not why we're here. I want to focus on what came of the famous board game, the video game editions. Many unlicensed, non-commercial computer games based on Monopoly were distributed on bulletin board systems, public domain software disks, and academic computer systems, and appeared as early as the late 1970s. At the time, Parker Brothers was unaware of this distribution, until a user informed them of one version that stated a Parker Brothers game on the title screen. The company then began enforcing its copyright and trademark on Monopoly. The games begin in 1985. The first known legit video game version of Monopoly released on the Amiga, Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, MS-DOS, and many other versions. Published by Leisure Genius, there isn't much to find on the history of this company, although I did find that they made other games like Scrabble. This game is not bad for being the first version of it, since you don't really have much to compare it to at the time. No sound effects, no music, just you and your cousin and your little brother yelling at each other. Up to 8 players, whether it be a human or a computer. The Amiga Power magazine said it best. I can't really see 6 players gathering around the Amiga after dinner. And I can agree, unless you're a hardcore Monopoly fan, and alone in 1985. I give this version a 5 out of 10 just for the nostalgia. In 1988, we finally get Monopoly for a console release. The Sega Master System is a third-generation 8-bit home video game console manufactured by Sega. And let me tell you, the sound in this Monopoly is terrible. The main theme is fine, but it almost sounds like the programmer wrote everything 2 octaves higher than they should have. Likely a limitation of the sound chip. But for some time, Sega had wanted the license rights to Monopoly. Parker Brothers granted them the license in 1987 via Tonka. The idea was to adapt popular board games to increase the Sega Master System's place in the United States. Due to Japan's unfamiliarity of American board games, Japanese programmers could not develop the game. Sega turned their attention to Nexa, which was based in San Francisco. After 3 months of development, the team was behind schedule. The whole thing was one big mess. They had to hire 2 programmers for $10,000 each. Due to the bad quality of the programming code, they had to start from scratch. Using Sega's graphic tools that were super buggy made it difficult to implement the game graphics. The programmers were able to finish 6 months later, which was still 3 months after Sega's intended deadline. Graphically it looks alright. I would say for something as small as the Master System, it seems to handle the game pretty well. Only thing that might bother you is the clunky animations and the confusing menus. Other than that, the game deserves a 6 out of 10 from me, as long as you can turn down the volume. Now this is a little bit of a bonus. As I was researching, I happened to stumble upon this game on internetarchive.org. It seems to be an unlicensed version from a Shareware pack in 1989 by Richard Tom. I highly doubt this version is officially licensed, but it's very unique from the other versions for the time. You choose the credit limit. It looks as if you can have up to 16 players. Tom also has instructions on how to play the game, which he says Parker Brothers allow, if they actually did allow it. He then asks you to send him $30 to register the game. I wonder how many people actually registered. Anyways.
How did I make it big? I know how! To play the game, I buy real estate, hotels, fancy cars, even railroads, and I take chances. To make it big, uh-oh, you've got to play the game. I'm Monopoly Dave.
In 1991, we were blessed by Sculptured Software, who made Mortal Kombat 1 and 2 for SNES, who then made Monopoly for NES and Game Boy. This is probably my favorite version so far, considering you could take this version with you on your Game Boy, or play it on America's favorite game console at the time. The game is well polished, easy to control, and has a rather inviting opening theme song. The graphics are simple, as they should be, and look even better on the NES. Sculpture Software also made another version for the SNES and the Genesis. The SNES version, I played quite a bit in my childhood. I still enjoy playing that version to this day. Gary can't get enough of this version, and neither can I. The graphics improved quite a bit coming from the Game Boy and NES, but still holds the same format. One thing I noticed while researching the 2 different versions is the Genesis version seems to have much different audio than the SNES version, rather graphically looking very similar. It's threw me off quite a bit. Don't Be Coming Back Here Now, after getting released from jail, is much more polite in the SNES version compared to the other versions as well.
Don't Be Coming Back Now.
Don't you be coming back here now.
Don't you be coming back here now.
All in all, I gotta hand it to Sculpture Software for these additions. I give these a 10 out of 10.
Hello, I'm Bill Gates, Chairman of Microsoft. In this video, you're going to see the future.
The next edition I want to go over is the MS-DOS version in 1991 and 1995. Virgin Interactive Entertainment made a really fun edition of the board game with more of an in-control feel, with lots of different game options, lots of pieces to choose from. If you aren't familiar with older games, you will definitely have trouble navigating this game, as well as selecting your opponent difficulty level. The main theme can be skipped by pressing escape, and the game can be started by pressing F1. This game relies on your cursor instead of menus. The nice thing about this version that other versions don't have is the history screen, so you can bite into your Big Mac and Diet Coke, and come back and see what happened 10 seconds ago. But pay attention, if an opponent or computer lands on your own property, you have to press the Rent Do button, otherwise they get to skip out on rent.
You might wonder what I'm doing here. Well, I'm getting kind of an inside look at some of these new games. I think you'll be amazed at all the new games we're going to show you here this evening.
In 1995 is where Monopoly started to get into the 3D graphics game. The game looks similar to the 1991 version, although is heavily improved with the components of physical gameplay, given automation and digital representations. 3D animations are provided for player movement across the board. Up to 6 human players can play either on the same computer or over LAN. The game's music was in a MIDI format and had a ragtime theme, while the sound effects were in wave. Like the board game, this game includes options for many house rules you can play in real life, and a May 1995 edition of Banger Daily. It was reported that Hasbro Interactive was currently testing the game, which the company claimed would be the first to have a multiplayer feature allowing players to play each other over the internet. I give them both a solid 7. The PlayStation 1. If you didn't have one of these growing up, you didn't have a childhood. This console was blessed with Monopoly in 1997, the same year as the Nokia 3310. Developed by Gremlin Interactive and published by Hasbro Interactive, despite using the same box art as the 1995 PC version, it is not the same game. Considering the board game cost you $10 in 1997, this console version costs roughly around $50. Having a digital version means you can play whenever you want and wherever you want, although that does depend on AI. Unfortunately, this game has terrible AI, really long load times, and a clunky interface. That only if you had the supported PlayStation mouse released with the launch edition in Japan, you would be clicking along just fine. IGN gave the game a 3 out of 10 in 1998, mentioning if you land on a property and auction it, AI won't even bother to bid against you. You could be rolling in the properties for half price, or maybe even $1. Oh well, at least you get Monopoly on the PS1. If that was your only game console in 1997, I'd give this version a healthy 5. And that brings us to the last Monopoly game in the era that is the 80s and the 90s.
Player's Choice games for N64. Mario Kart, Wave Race, Star Fox.
Oh man!
Cruisin' USA, Super Mario.
I think I'm in wrong.
Each one of these great games is $39.95.
What's going on here?
And each one is a million seller. You can look for the Player's Choice logo.
If you're like me, chances are you have had or played a Nintendo 64 in your life. If you haven't, then maybe you got lucky this time. In 1999, Mind-Eye Productions developed a new type of Monopoly game like of which we have never seen before. With its childish animations and interesting AI selections, the game looks like it takes place less than a living room where you play board games, and more so like your LSD trip at a laser light show. Instead of the AI being people controlling the game pieces, you are the game pieces, with eyes and a mouth, and it just gives me the heebie-jeebies. I will say if you were a kid and didn't know anything about board games, then this might be fun for you. What can I say though? Nintendo Power gave the game a 6.5 out of 10, which in my opinion is pretty generous. I guess I might be getting too picky, considering my bias for the NES and DOS versions being far more superior. Mind-Eye Productions went on to make a game in 2000 that was far more enjoyable than the version of Monopoly called Thomas Trouble on the Tracks. Damn right there's trouble on the tracks when this engine rolls up. And there we have it. Now that you've learned the history of Monopoly and the history of the different games developed for the classic board game, I'm hoping you found this video enjoyable. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and maybe I'll make a video on the 2000s to the 2010 editions of the game. Thanks for hanging out, I'll see you next time.